Pearcey, welcome to Apollo's Watered.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
It's glad to have you back.
Yes, we've had a couple of chats.
Yeah, we have. And I always thoroughly enjoy the conversation. I always thoroughly do. But are you ready for the Fast Five?
Oh, the Fast Five. Okay, on my toes here.
Okay, here we go. This is an easy one for you. Your preferred fashion choice in one word.
Country.
That's your preferred fashion choice is country?
Yeah.
What? You have to describe that. I want some elaboration here. You have to elaborate on that.
LL Bean.
Oh, that's a good one. I wouldn't put them as country.
I used to live in the country. I grew up in the country in Indiana. We lived, we owned 5 acres on a 15-acre plot of woods. And so to me, childhood is associated with being out in the country, climbing trees, you know, wading in the creek. And I just love, you know, outdoorsy country type.
I thought you grew up in Minnesota.
Oh, I was born there. I lived there for a year. A year.
I didn't know you were from India. Where in Indiana are you from?
So my dad taught at Purdue University. So we were just outside of West Lafayette.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's a beautiful country there. That's some beautiful places.
Oh, trees.
Oh yeah, beautiful. All right, here we go. Number 2. Your most favorite vacation spot in the world.
A forest. After what I just told you.
Does it matter where the forest is, though?
No,
is it like redwood? Just give you trees.
Well, my childhood memories would be mostly deciduous trees because it's Indiana. So yeah, but any trees, frankly, I'll go for it.
Indiana has some really beautiful trees, especially in southern Indiana, in Nashville, with the covered bridges and all that there. It's so nice, so beautiful. All right, number 3, the one book outside of the Bible that has most influenced your life and why.
Oh, Francis Schaeffer. And the you know, his 2 main apologetics books, The God Who Was There and Escape from Reason, because that's how I became a Christian. So that was a huge influence on my life. I did become a Christian through a visit to L'Abri in Switzerland. I was attending school in Germany at the time, and through a series of complex circumstances, I ended up going to L'Abri in Switzerland. So by far, Francis Schaeffer has had the greatest influence on my life. And if you read my books, you'll see the influence there.
You know, I have a friend of mine who is at a publishing house who actually has his unpublished letters. Oh. And I got to read them. Oh, just fascinating. Did he really wear the breeches? Did he really wear those things?
Lederhosen.
Lederhosen. I have to say it. Lederhosen. I can't do the accent. I can't do it. Did he really wear that though?
Of course. I mean, he dressed like the locals. I mean, like Hudson Taylor did. Remember? Taylor.
I wasn't there, but
he pioneered the idea that Hudson Taylor pioneered the idea that you should dress like the natives. And so Hudson Taylor, you know, dressed like Chinese and wore a long pigtail and, you know, and so Francis Schaeffer looked like a Swiss farmer. It was a small farming village. L'Abri was located in a small farming village high up in the Swiss Alps, and he dressed like the local farmers. So
what made him pick Switzerland?
Oh, it was he went to Europe originally. He was sent to Europe by Child Evangelism Fellowship, and they wanted him to evaluate the state of the churches after World War II. You know, what do we do to help rebuild the churches? And so he traveled through Europe, brought back his report, and they said, we think you should do it. And so they sent him to Europe and said, okay, it's your job. And why it ended up Switzerland, I'm not quite sure, you know, fairly central location in Europe. But that's how he ended up in Europe. And as you know, then eventually the ministry sort of organically grew into young people coming to his home and staying in his home and actually talking one-on-one for long periods. And another group of students, it transformed when his own daughters got old enough to go down the mountain to Lausanne University. And they would talk to their friends about God and religion. And when their friends had questions, they would say, you should talk to my dad. He's good with questions like that. And so they would take the little train, you know, the little Alps. There's little trains in the Alps. They'd go up the mountainside. And because it was so inaccessible, they would spend the whole weekend. And then they would tell their
Oh.
friends, and another group would come up the next weekend, and they tell their friends, and that's how it organically grew into a place where you would come and actually stay for a while and live with a Christian family. The way it grew was if another family or a couple said, we like what you're doing, or maybe they even converted through L'Abri, and then they would buy a home down the street, a chalet. Chalet sounds like a luxury home, but that's just what people live in the Swiss Alps. Farmers live in chalets. So they would buy a chalet down the street, and they would open their home, and someone else would join the ministry and open a chalet down the street the other way. And so it grew very naturally into a place where you live with a Christian family and you see Christianity lived out day by day, as opposed to, going to a conference and seeing a talking head. You actually got to see whether they lived it. We got to see whether Schaeffer actually lived, walked the talk. That was what made it so powerful, I think, is that he wasn't just another talking head. He was somebody where you saw day by day, day in and day out, doing the chores side by side, how authentic his faith really was.
How many biographies are there of Schaeffer?
I'm not sure, but I don't think any of them really capture. I've never read one that I really thought captured it very well.
Okay.
It was so unique.
Yeah. I found the book that Ivy just did, Think Christianly, on the Study Center movement. Do you have the book?
Oh, no.
No, it's on the Study Center movement. They talk about L'Abri and all the different study centers. So I've been waiting to dig in to it. I just haven't had the time yet, but I want to know more. Oh, you'd ask.
Oh, never mind.
I have to look around.
You can edit this out.
I'll edit all this out of there. Don't worry about all that. We always get to talk about this kind of stuff. But let's go on to our next question. Oh, no, go ahead.
There was a real switch. I don't know if you need this. You could edit it out if you don't. But there was a real switch in L'Abri. When I was there twice, because I didn't become a Christian the first time. I was too stubborn. So the first time I went, I only stayed a month because it was so attractive. I had never run into apologetics before, and I had no idea Christianity could be defended with good reasons and arguments, and I could talk to people who actually knew, Western intellectual history, and they could talk intelligently about it because I had been studying philosophy. I was a philosophy major. And so I left and came back a year and a half later, and already it had started to change. It changed when Schaeffer wrote his books. When I was there the first time, it was mostly word of mouth still, and it was mostly intellectually seeking non-Christians. And then when I went back a year and a half later, his books had come out. He was getting known in the Christian world, and it shifted to emotionally troubled Christians, because a lot of Christian kids have doubts because of relational issues with their parents and so on. And so it was a major shift, and L'Abri spent several years praying and discussing, how do we handle this?
Is L'Abri still going?
Yeah.
Is it
yeah,
really?
But it's very different now. It now feels like, like a Christian camp. It's
interesting. Well, I knew there were L'Abris, like there's one in Massachusetts.
That one's still pretty good. And I think the one in England is still pretty good.
Okay. I was curious. That's interesting.
But yeah, I actually ran into a college student, and I said, yeah, I went there as a non-Christian. Oh, they let non-Christians come? That's all it was when I was there the first time. It was really an evangelistic ministry with mostly non-Christians. So it was very stimulating. That some people call that the real L'Abri. Because the ethos was just so different with all these non-Christians.
Hold on one second. Now I'm having audio problems. Give me 1 second. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. Sorry, there was a pop, and I couldn't hear you for a second, and something I thought it would come out play. I'll edit all that in. I'll edit all that
again.
Okay. Not again. This time it's me, but this time. All right. Here's your next question, which I already think I know the answer of what you said before, but your favorite leisurely activity besides reading?
Playing my violin.
Do you still play a lot?
Yeah.
Do you really? Do you do any concerts anywhere?
No, what I do. So my mother is a professional violinist. And so every summer I go to visit her. And so I practice up so that we can play duets together.
How old is your mom?
Vivaldi duets, some Bach duets. Telemann duets. And so that's kind of the highlight of my year. I used to have a colleague here at Houston Christian who played, and we played together, but now it's just once a year I get to play with my mom.
How old is your mother?
95.
Oh my goodness. And she's still playing.
She's still playing.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
I think it's what keeps her alive. I mean, because the mental stimulation, they say with older people, you should learn a language or play a musical instrument. So
right. No, I love that. The fact that she's still playing and she was was that intimidating having a professional violinist as a mother?
No.
Okay.
No. It was, well, what it was is, okay, there were 6 kids in the family. We all had to play an instrument.
Oh.
And actually what it was more sort of punitive. I mean, it was like, you have to practice. My parents didn't know how to motivate us positively. And so they would motivate us in a very negative way.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to sort of overcome that when I became a young adult then, because I had very negative feelings toward my violin, mostly because of that very punitive approach to practicing. So I had to sort of get over that, and I did. Now I'm in love with it again.
Yeah, well, you're playing with your 95-year-old mother. Okay, how about this one? This is the final question of the Fast Five, which has become the Slow Five. But if you could be one song, what song would you be and why? That's an interesting one. I've never asked this one before, so I'm curious.
Well, the thing is, I don't listen to songs. I don't listen to popular music, if you mean popular songs.
No, not popular. Anything. Classical, whatever you want to play, whatever song you want to be.
During the pandemic, see, this is the Slow Five. During the pandemic, the Metropolitan Opera put their operas on to listen for free. Every night, a different opera. And so I got like a course in opera and learned to love opera. And I suppose if I were to choose a favorite one, maybe an aria from La Traviata by Verdi. That's probably Verdi's most popular opera, and it's got very beautiful arias. So I still, now that they no longer offer them for free, I can go online and still listen to individual arias. So I listen to them still. So that's what I would go for, a Verdi aria.
I always like to hear what interests people, because it's just God has just made people to be so diverse and so many interests, and you learn about people and their interests, and it exposes me to things that I didn't know about. And then I want to go and look about it and become better myself, whether it's books that people read, arias, things like that. I just love that. But let's talk about your book. You have a new book, Nancy, and it's not out yet. It will be soon, right after we run this conversation. The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, produced by Baker, isn't it? Baker did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so delighted to read this book, but even the title, you said in the book, it's your most provocative or most controversial book. And in our world today, there's nothing more controversial than let's talk about gender and Christianity. And you hit both. So let's talk about this book. What made you want to write and just delve right into the midst of this subject in the middle of a culture war in which we find ourselves?
Yeah. It is the most controversial book I've ever written, which was a surprise because Love Thy Body, my last book, dealt with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism. I really thought that would be the most controversial, but in the Christian world, this has proven to be more controversial. The nutshell answer that we can unpack is that I saw a problem and I saw a solution. And the problem, of course, was that masculinity is being attacked so viciously. It's become culturally acceptable to be incredibly hostile to masculinity. I was really shocked one day when the Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Like, wait, that used to be some fringe feminist group would talk like that, not a mainstream publication like the Washington Post. The Huffington Post had an editor who said her New Year's resolution was kill all men. You can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And then there are books out with titles like,
Oh,
literally, I hate men, no good men, and are men necessary? So, and even men have jumped on the bandwagon. You may have seen this. It's not in my book because it just came out. But the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. Or a book author wrote, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So no wonder a major survey found that 46% of American men say that society punishes men basically just for being men. And that one's in the book, but there's a new one. Again, as soon as you write your book, there's new items. A new one that was done in Britain just now, a couple of weeks ago. 55% of men, so more than half, say that discrimination against men is now worse than discrimination against women. So whether you agree or not, that is a lot of people who think the male bashing has gone too far. And so I wanted to understand, where's this coming from? The way to stand effectively against a social trend is you really need to understand where it came from and how it developed. You just can't take it at face value today. And so in the Toxic War on Masculinity, I got sort of behind the scenes and look at how this concept developed over time, kind of go up for the bird's eye view. So you can see it developing, and then that way you understand it better and you can counter it better.
Well, it reminded me, as I was reading the book, that it reminded me of Carl Truman's The Rise and Triumph of the rise and triumph of the modern self, because what he did was chronicling how he got to this place of the sexual revolution, and I saw that within your book as you were identifying toxic masculinity, and even the fact that we're having this conversation, or excuse me, the toxic war on masculinity. I want to make sure I get my terminology right there, because I've seen so many books and so many Christian books now as of late. It's gone to this side where so many women were or femininity was really pushed down within the church. And then you get the other side, which is all masculine and it's just steak all the time and men's ministry. But it's more of a cultural understanding of, or even almost like a stereotype of what they think men should be. And you actually pull that out a bit in the book. So I like the fact that you rooted it early on in American history and how that we tried to have our early understandings of how masculinity formed. And it's different than what we see today. You actually mentioned that it was a very positive view. The husband and father had a very positive view in the family, and people wrote about that. But how did we, go ahead, elaborate on that. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I do start, I kind of limit myself to American history because otherwise the book would be too big, but it also gives me the opportunity to, in a sense, start with Christianity, and not just in the abstract, but you can see how it was actually lived out in the colonial era because so many people were Christian at the time. And so the social expectations of manhood were very much geared towards caretaking and responsibility. And it was easier to live it out because before the Industrial Revolution, families were together 24 hours a day, right? Husbands are working with their wives all day. They're training their children. They're working side by side on the family farm, in the family industry, the family shop. And so fathers were intimately involved with their families. And so the concepts of masculinity were much more geared toward having responsibility for your family. And not only that, but a very common phrase at the time was that you also were supposed to be fathers of the community. You're supposed to bring that fathering ethos out into the community. The definition of authority at that time had a very specific meaning. It meant who has responsibility for the common good. So, each individual naturally looks out for their own good. I look out for what's good for me. You look out for what's good for you. But who looks out for the common good of the marriage, the family, the church, civil society, and so on? And that's what authority was for. It was, the favorite word at the time was disinterested, meaning whoever was in authority did not look out for his own self-interest. He looked out for the interests of the whole. So it was a very positive view of authority as well. How did we lose that? The turning point was the Industrial Revolution, because it meant two things. First of all, work was taken out of the home. So men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with their families, with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And you already in the 19th century, you see the rhetoric start to change as people protest that the men are changing, that men are losing that caretaking mentality. When they're working as individuals, it feels a lot more like I have to look out for number one, right? I have to be aggressive and ambitious and acquisitive and, pushing myself forward in the struggle for survival. And so people began to write about it. Men are kind of losing their ethical stance. As one letter to the editor in a newspaper put it at the time, men are selling their souls for mammon, mammon for wealth.
Right.
And it said in the process, it said the American man is losing his soul. But at the same time, so that was the structural changes that were going on. And then at the same time, American society was being secularized, because after the Industrial Revolution, there arose a huge public sphere, business, industry, factories, banks, financial institutions, academia, universities, and the state. And people began to say, well, these big institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant primarily value-free. And so, in other words, the language began to be, don't bring your private values into the public square, which is what we still hear today. And so men in particular then are being exposed to a secular education, working in a secular environment, and they begin to have a more secularized definition of masculinity. So it was the two things. There was a structural change, and then there was the secularization. And between the two of them, we kind of lost the biblical understanding of masculinity.
Well, even then, you bring in the biblical aspect of it. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting, most people, when they critique today, they say Christian, let's even say white, we'll get into that, but you even delve outside of that. So it's not just white. You're looking at masculinity. You cite people in Chile and Brazil and South America, and a culture that's really known for their masculinity. But what you've noted is that it's not actually conservative Christian men that are going to church that are the problem, that are the ones that are guilty of abuse and divorce and these toxic traits that are often brought out in the culture. You say it's an entirely different group. Now, who is that group that's doing most of that abuse?
Yeah, so I said I saw a problem and an answer. And this is the answer. The answer is that most people don't realize that sociologically, Christian men are testing out very well. It's easy to find people saying that, exhibit A of toxic masculinity is evangelical men. Let me read you a few of them just so you get a flavor of it. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Another one, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. A third one, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. Well, the problem with these accusations is that they ignore the data from the social sciences. Sociologists read these accusations and said, yeah, but where's the evidence? Where's your evidence? And so they started doing the studies. And it's only been in recent decades, so they're fairly new. And I had to go digging in the academic sociological journals to find them. And so that's another reason I wanted to write the book, is to bring this out and make it public. But what sociologists have found is what you just said, that Christian men who attend church regularly, in other words, really committed ones, are the most loving husbands and fathers. So they do, by the way, they do interview the wives separately. And so what they're doing is so what they're reporting is that the wives say that they're the happiest with their husband's expressions of love and appreciation. Evangelical fathers also test out as the most engaged with their children, both in shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or bedtime, the evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce. And the real stunner, they have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any group in America. So Christians don't know this. I talked when I give lectures at Christian universities and seminaries. We don't know this. My sort of go-to sociologist, the one who did the largest study, is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And listen to what he wrote in the New York Times, of all places. He said, it turns out, this is a direct quote, turns out that the happiest of all wives in America, they're testing the wives because the assumption is that any sort of male headship or authority is oppressive, tyrannical, patriarchal. So the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So I was shocked that the New York Times would print that. And then he turns to his, Brad Wilcox turns to his fellow academics, because those are his peers. And he says to them, this is my favorite line, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and about evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So the bottom line is that Christianity, or Christians, have a practical answer to reconciling the sexes, to use my subtitle, that stood up to rigorous empirical testing. And we don't even know this. We need to get the word out to encourage Christian men, because they're feeling the same denigration from the culture. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So many Christian men are also feeling this sort of the general attack on masculinity. So I would love to see us be able to show that the secular media is wrong about Christian men, and we can show it with empirical data.
Well, go ahead.
And while we're at it, I wanted to respond to the other part of your question, because you brought up the international side of it, and I love that. Because even though I focus mostly on the US, I do have a section on studies around the globe. And you have a global audience. So so I have 3 studies that I cite. One of them was by an anthropologist who just went to Colombia. So it's a smaller study, but so she starts out as a Marxist. She expects to find that evangelicals are patriarchal and controlling. And she found the exact opposite. She was amazed. She said that the machismo culture in Latin America encourages men to, be out in the public realm where you're drinking and smoking and gambling and visiting prostitutes. And she said, when a man becomes an evangelical, he stops all of that and directs his money to his family instead. His family experiences a higher standard of living, and they all do better. She says evangelicalism is the best women's movement in terms of the impact it has in the third world, in the developing world. And then there was a much larger study done by a sociologist at the University of London. So she went to Africa and Asia, included that as well. And she found the same thing. She calls it the evangelical gender paradox, because it's exactly the opposite of what critics expect. And she said, the church helps men put the needs of the household above their own pleasure. And she concludes that Christianity has done more to improve the lives of poor women around the globe than Western aid societies have, and that Western feminism has. And she too says, it's fascinating. She uses a similar language, saying, this is the best women's movement in the developing countries. It's just, and then she puts it this way, she says, it's this unsophisticated, backward form of Christianity that's actually helping women the best. And then the third person I quote, you may have seen this because it's a best-selling book. It's called Half the Sky. It's by a New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof. And yes, because he was willing, although I think himself is a very secular person, he went to different countries around the world and said, again, that it's the evangelical church that is helping women more than any other institution. He says the evangelical church applies community pressure to bring wayward husbands back into line. It discourages alcoholism and adultery. And it said those are two things that have caused enormous suffering to women in these countries. And so it's fascinating that, as far as I know, none of these anthropologists or writers were Christian. And all of them said, we're seeing the same thing that the sociologists are seeing here in the US. They're seeing the same impact of evangelicalism around the world, that it does reconnect men to their family and make them responsible in ways that they, that the surrounding culture doesn't necessarily expect them to be.
Well, this is something that is so contrary to the popular secular narrative, as you've already alluded to. And we've had other guests on the show, Glenn Scrivener, who wrote the book, The Air We Breathe, and he was looking at the positive contributions of Christianity to Western culture. And a friend of ours that we have in common, Vishal Mangalwadi, in his book, where he talks about how the Bible shaped our civilization to the very foundation. So what you see across the board is that Christianity has a positive effect for all of the negative that have been out there, which seem to be more the exception than the rule. However, as you've noted, it's not just it's the conservative, really Bible believers that we're by far and away have a higher satisfaction when it comes to marriage, family. Now, again, we always know that there are those who have done it wrong, and not everyone is a perfect person, and there's been abuse. But really the ones who have been the most guilty of this, and you noted, are the nominal Christians. Those who go maybe to church once in a while, they have the rhetoric, but not the substance. And I thought that was a very important, the way that you separated those two. Elaborate on that for us so that we can help people understand who really is perpetrating this idea of toxic masculinity in our culture today.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting findings as well, because one reason we don't know how well Christians are doing is because we all have heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture. And in my research, I found that that's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. Well, it's not true. But what happened is the sociologists went back to the data. And like you said, they divided out men who are truly authentically Christian and attend church regularly versus nominal Christians. By the way, I have to explain to my students, they don't know what nominal means. It means in name only. N-O-M means name in Latin. And these are men who, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, but who in fact go to church rarely, if at all. And they test out shockingly differently. So they test out, their wives report the lowest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men. And the real shocker, they have the highest rate of domestic violence, higher than secular men. And so this is what skews the statistics, because they are out there claiming an evangelical identity. And many studies will put these two groups together, right? They'll just say, oh, well, let's study evangelicals. And so you get, on the one hand, men who are much better than the secular world, and then you have men who are worse than the secular world. So if you put them together, obviously, the statistics are going to be skewed. To quote my go-to sociologist again, Brad Wilcox, who wrote an article on it for Christianity Today. And he said, the most violent husbands in America are nominal Christians who attend church rarely, if at all. And so, and people ask me, well, why do you think they're actually worse than secular men, though? And it appears to be that they pick up the language of headship and submission, but they infuse secular meanings, secular meanings of entitlement and dominance and control and so on. But they're all actually worse than secular men, because then they feel they have religious sanction for it. So I'm very careful to say it's not because of scripture. It's clearly not, because many people will say, well, it's the scripture, it's a scriptural teaching that causes men to be, heartless patriarchs. No, it's the men who are not following scripture, who'll pick up a few phrases and then infuse secular meaning into it. So the important thing for us as Christians is to ask, well, what is the secular meaning then? This is why I wrote the book too. You need to have a critical grid of what secularism says about masculinity, so that you don't absorb it unawares. So I agree with you. One of the most striking things to come out of the sociological literature is to help explain that there's very committed Christian men, and then there's nominals. And in America, there's a lot of nominals. There's a lot of cultural Christians. Right? I used to think they were a small group, because you and I probably hang out mostly with committed Christian people. And then I read at least one study said, no, they're about the same size. So you have a 50-50 chance that the person you meet who claims to be evangelical may be just a nominal. And that's an important thing for churches to know, because these men are hanging around the fringes of the Christian church. So how do we minister to them? How do we reach out to them? How do we help them to see that what they're doing is is destructive, and they cannot claim that label while living like a secular person?
Which is what we find. I mean, as you mentioned and you alluded to, having been a pastor for over 20 years and seeing those situations of abuse that did happen, but most of the time the abuse that did occur were those people that would master the language, but you could tell the substance wasn't there, and you could just sense it. But it's a lot more incipient, because you can hide behind flowering language. But with the church too, with Me Too, you're starting to see much more people becoming more open about abuse, which is a good thing, so that we can address it, so that we can forsake it, because that's not what scripture calls us to. As I alluded to once in a sermon in talking about Ephesians chapter 5, and you mentioned that in the book, where you have someone saying Christ loved the church, that he would give himself for her. And I remember saying to a group of men, Jesus didn't beat his church. He didn't beat his church, but yet you see people or you've heard instances of that occurring. One of the things that I also found very interesting about your book is you were showing the progression in the Industrial Revolution. You go back to colonial times, seeing how families had been together, seeing how the husbands had been removed. They're working apart in the public arena. That fact value split, as you mentioned in the book, and I really appreciated. But one of the things that I thought you articulated that I hadn't thought of was how the stories began to represent men as bad, and that became what was really taught. And I kept thinking of that phrase, words make worlds. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and we can see this in movies and in film, we have a tendency to emulate. What did you discover? Or a better question is, how did you even think to go into these novels? You mentioned Nathaniel Hawthorne. You mentioned Washington Irving. You were bringing out these stories of how our understanding of masculinity has been shaped by these American authors. What made you go in that direction to help understand this idea of masculinity?
Well, you have probably noticed that most of my books have mostly secular sources.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I noticed that. And you have a lot of them, you have a wide variety of secular sources in there. I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, it's the most data-driven book that I've written, by the way, because you have the sociological data that we just talked about, and then we have all this historical data. And so right now there are libraries full of books on the history of women because of feminism. I found about 3 books on the history of men. So, it was only a couple of books out there. They were very good. And then you'll have a couple books like on the history of fatherhood and so on, most isolated topics. But this information is out there. It's just that Christians aren't reading these books. And that's another reason I wrote the book, is to bring this information to the Christian world. But let me, I go through several stages in the secular definition of masculinity. And let me pinpoint just one of them because it's so influential, and that was the rise of Darwinism.
Yes,
Darwinian
social
evolution.
Darwinism, right? Yeah, you mentioned that.
Because social Darwinism, basically, they said the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the men who were tough, egotistical, brutal, predatory, savage, barbarian. And so these are our ancestors, of our modern men. And therefore, this is our true nature, was what the message was, that the beast within is your true self. And all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had said, wait a minute, our animal impulses should be controlled by the higher faculties of spirit and moral will. And now that was flipped. And people began to say, no, your animal nature is your true nature. And it's covered by a thin veneer of civilization. That was one of their favorite phrases. It's just a thin veneer, and the true self is the uncivilized barbarian within. And this had an incredible impact, very negative impact, as you can imagine, on the secular definition, therefore, of manhood, that, this is our true nature. And you ask, well, how did women get along with such brutal men? And their answer was, this is Herbert Spencer, who was the major popularizer of Darwinism here in America. Spencer answers and says, well, women had to develop the ability to please. And then he added, it would also help if they learned how to hide their displeasure at such bad treatment. So this was the message of evolution. And then Darwin himself explicitly argued that women were inferior, mentally and socially and intellectually. And he said, he acknowledged that women were more sensitive, intuitive, but then he said, those are the traits of the lower species. So even women's positive traits were signs of their inferiority. And Thomas Huxley, who was, Darwin's bulldog, quote unquote, he had that moniker, argued that because women's inferiority is a product of natural selection, there's no way to overcome it, even with educational selection. In other words, we can't educate her to a higher level. So the impact of Darwinism was a huge part of developing a very negative secular script for masculinity.
Which is what you show in these different novels that had been written, where they grab a hold of that social Darwinianism or Darwinism, and then they start articulating that in the stories where they make these men to be going off into their animalistic nature. And one of the things that I thought was very fascinating, because now we have the book, Jesus and John Wayne, right? This is an idea that's gone on in American culture. I know other people have talked about it. People have told me about the book. And then you have this, you actually draw out the idea of the Western, which I thought was very interesting, where you get into the history of the modern Western, or the Western novel at that time, and the image that it was conveying and the story that it was telling to young men on what it meant to be a man. But that was really this Darwinian idea, these loners that are going it on their own. But why did you feel the need to include that? Or why did you want, not feel the need, excuse me, why did you want to include that in your book so that people could get this idea of how masculinity has been shaped and formed?
Well, first of all, because it's a fact. I'm being factual. This is what happened. But here's, I'll add some more background. So in the 19th century, because of the secularization of the public square, men's behavior was actually growing worse. I mean, they're not feeling as bound by Christian ethics. And so the 19th century saw a huge increase in drinking, gambling, smoking, prostitution. The number of brothels mushroomed. And sometimes it's easy to remember with a specific fact. So here's your fact. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
You said that was the highest time of alcoholism in American culture in 1830. I'd never heard that stat before. So I was surprised. I went, really? That's the highest? It's not people leaving Bud Light now? I mean, is that where we're at?
And so there was a reason for all the reform movements of the 19th century, like the temperance movement. Right. Men were drinking away the family money, leaving their leaving their family destitute. They were coming home and beating their wives because they were drunk. Public drunkenness, people just falling down drunk in the streets was becoming a problem. And so there was a huge reform movement. And by the way, it was especially young men. They were coming in from the countryside to get jobs in the city. And so they were being separated from their traditional structures of authority, like their family, their church, their village. And they were much more prone to fall prey to the vices, in the city. And so the reform movements, however, were driven largely by women because they were attacking what were primarily traditionally male vices: drinking, gambling, prostitutes. And in the 19th century, what was also happening, of course, is as the secular realm said, we need to be, as the public realm said, we need to be secular and value free. Well, who then is in charge of values? Well, you relegate those to the private realm. And who's in charge of them then? Well, women are, because women are still in the private realm at the time. And so for the first time ever in human history, women were said to be more morally and spiritually superior to men. This was completely new. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had thought that men were more moral. They had argued that the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men are more moral. They are stronger in keeping their, evil impulses under control. And so this was completely new, that in the 19th century, people began to say that women were morally superior. And one way that they expressed that was by saying, well, in that case, we need to bring our moral superior view into the public realm. And so they drove a lot of these reform movements. Well, by the end of the 19th century, men began to rebel because that was very demeaning to men, to say that men were just naturally more prone to sin and vice, especially in areas like sex and alcohol. And by the way, I just was interviewed a few days ago by a young man in his 20s, and he said, it's in the church today. He said, it's just assumed that men are going to have more trouble with sex and porn and addiction and so on, and that it's up to women, it's up to their wives, to hold them in check. So apparently, at least in some circles, it's still much the same attitude. But at any rate, you asked about the novels. Mm-hmm. So in the late 19th century, men began to say, we're tired of women telling us that we're the bad guys, that we're the villains in society. And so there was a new term was coined. It was over civilization. People said, men are now no longer becoming, they're no longer the hardy boys working on the farm. Mm-hmm. They're city boys, they're soft, they're effeminate. We need to create men again. And so that's where those novels came in. They said, okay, we need to get away from women because they're the moralists, they're the moralists of society, away from women, away from civilization, out into the wild, climbing mountains and hunting elk. And the novels of the time all featured men who were outdoors men, mountain men, scouts, and so on. Think of Melville, for example. Mm-hmm. He set all of his novels at sea. And you know why? He said, because the sea is where men face the utmost license. That's his phrase, the utmost moral license. And the idea that we have to, one literary critic put it this way: the protagonist of American fiction is the man on the run. He's on the run away from civilization, away from women, out into the wilderness, because he's decided that he finds his true nature out in the wild. So this was one more stage in the secularization of the concept of masculinity, because instead of saying, no, men find their true nature being deeply embedded in their family, it said, they got to get away, they need to get out into the wild. And so I come back again and again in the book to the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate is Genesis, when God creates human beings, and he says, here's your job description. here's why I made you. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the very streamlined language of Genesis 1 that can be unpacked, be fruitful and multiply is not just the family, but also all of the social institutions that historically grow out of the family, the clan, the tribe, the village, the nation, and also social institutions like the school, the government, the marketplace. And so it means develop all of these social institutions. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So it's not just farming, but mining and building, making bridges, building buildings, inventing computers, composing music. One of my students said, oh, come on, composing music? How is that part of the cultural mandate? And I play the violin. So I said, what's a violin made out of? Well, wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty you associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And so instead of getting away from civilization, I keep coming back to that with, the biblical view of masculinity is that you roll up your sleeves and you invest more deeply in your family and in the social institutions that grow out of it. You invest more deeply in doing productive work that is useful to your society, that is creative and productive. And that's where you find your meaning, because that's pre-fall. That's the commission God gave us pre-fall. And that's where our understanding of masculinity should really be rooted.
Which is something that I don't think we talk about very often. I mean, even as you were talking about, you were quoting different scriptures where you're citing Paul, where we need to reach mature manhood. And you even cite the fact that you said it's not referring to womanhood. That's not the opposite of it, but it's referring to being an adolescent. We need to mature up. We need to be working. We need to be engaging within society, within the public square in that arena. But we've become even more privatized. The more that modernity has continued to go on with, you saw again, industrialization, you see all of that occurring. We've become more and more removed from our family environments, the invention of the car, travel, all these things. We've separated from those family structures that have helped define meaning for who we are to be as men. And it's continued on. One of the things that I thought was very interesting for you in the book is that you mentioned how people are, it's moving backwards. Like the pendulum, now you're actually seeing a revolt to that, where people are with the families again, with people that are working from home a lot. They're able to be with their children. They're able to interact. You even mentioned people moving in multi-generations into a home because we have that structure and we need it, because there is a war on for the family. There is a war on masculinity and there's a war on femininity, even the very essence of what it means to be a human. Daniel Strange, who was on the show, and he's the director of the Crosslands Forum, had mentioned in Thermelios for the Gospel Coalition, he said in the first century, we're arguing over the nature of Jesus. The second century, we're arguing over the nature of salvation. The third century, we're talking over really, what does it mean to be a human? And be an engendered, embodied human, and you're addressing that fact. How do we help our people to see not the secularized concept of what masculinity is that's been taught under this kind of underlying narrative or current that's carried people along, but how do we help people to foster a biblical idea of what masculinity is, even though we've all been formed by the culture around us in ways that we don't even realize? How do we continue to really get back to that idea of masculinity, the way that God sees?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you started with the phrase "be a man," because many people are using that both positively and negatively. The progressives are using it negatively, like, oh, this is a way that we impose toxic masculinity on boys. And then you see Christians arguing the opposite and saying, no, it means, we should be more masculine. And ironically, it only appears twice in the scripture, and both times it means grow up. It means the manhood is being compared to childhood, not to womanhood. It's not saying don't be feminine. It means don't be immature. And by the way, that's the meaning it had in America right until the turn of the century. Secular historians say that. They say when people use the phrase "be a man" in our own American literature, up until the turn of the 20th century, they meant grow up, be mature. So they were taking that meaning from scripture. And then secondly, you can't write a book like that, like this, without having some practical solutions, which you alluded to as well. And that is that many people are finding that they want to find a way to rebuild the family. When you mentioned multi-generation households, the number was in the 40%. Like, what? 40% of new homes, of new requests are being made for, I want a place for my parents to live in a slightly, separate apartment, but attached. I was amazed at how high the numbers are, that either for parents or for returning, the parents have a separate apartment for returning children, both of them. And since the pandemic, it has become more acceptable to talk about how important it is to flex the workplace so that you can work part-time from home. One survey found that 65% of men said they got closer to their families during the pandemic, and they don't want to go back to work full-time. They would like to have some, 2 days a week at home or whatever, some way of having more time at home. And that statistic is in my book, Toxic War and Masculinity. But then another one came out more recently. So I'll tell you about this one because it's not in the book. But the New York Times actually had an article with a title something like, during the pandemic, many fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that. And I thought, well, there is a silver lining to the pandemic. It has made it more acceptable. So I have a whole chapter on ways that fathers in particular have tried to find ways to flex their work, have some time at home, even sometimes start a home-based business. I'll give you just one for a concrete example. I had a student whose husband was an IT professional, and during the pandemic, he came home to work. And because he was home, he was able to be more involved with the homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He began to be the one to take the kids to soccer and so on. And his wife, my student, was freed up enough from the family responsibilities that she started a part-time job. She was speaking of opera, we talked about opera earlier. She was an opera singer. One of my students was an opera singer. And so she started a part-time voice studio, and the entire family benefited from the additional income. So I interviewed her husband, and he said, our family life is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to a cubicle. And the final kicker was, he said, the time that I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife every morning. So I tried to give examples like that. There's no general principle. All you can do is give lots of anecdotes to help encourage people to think creatively about ways in which they might be able to adjust their work structure. Surveys show that millennials are really asking for more flexibility because they want more balance. They want to share jobs and earnings and raising kids. They want to share that a bit better between husband and wife. It's not always easy these days, but so I have a whole chapter just kind of trying to encourage people to at least think about it. And women too. I mean, I don't think I know any women who are home with children who are not doing some sidekick, some income producing activity on the side. So women have been doing this for a long time, trying to do economically productive work while raising their kids, and in a sense, recreating the colonial pattern, where both men and women could combine child rearing with economically productive work. And so they both had a better balance. We kind of act like women were given the half of the cultural mandate, be fruitful and multiply, and men were given the other half, subdue the earth. But they were given to both men and women. And I think both men and women are happier when they have a chance to have a more balanced life, doing both parts of the cultural mandate.
Well, that even alludes back to Proverbs 31, where a woman considers the field and buys it. This is something that I think that the church has lost, and has this very odd understanding of what the home life should be like. And it's much more of a captured moment in our history from the 1950s, the 1940s, even going back further. And you actually cite it again, coming through the 1800s and how the shape has gone. Even you allude to the fundamentals, you allude to how different people have understood it over time in novels. And then you get into the modern world, which I thought was very interesting because you reference Fight Club and then you reference incels, which is a term that you're seeing more and more. Describe this group of young men today that are filled with a lot of angst within society, and they create this idea of this. I mean, they're grabbing a hold of this toxic masculinity idea and running with it. Do you remember that part of the book when you get into the incels? Could you elaborate on that for us? Because some people are wondering, what are you talking about right now? But we're seeing that group cause a lot of problems and abuse within the world.
Yeah. Well, the general term is the manosphere.
Yeah.
Because it's a collection of groups on the internet that all have something to do with men's rights, or MGTOW is men going their own way, which is a group that says you should just, eschew women altogether. Don't have relationships with women. Use them for sex if you need to, but, don't have relationships with them. Red pill and incels and volcils. Incels is involuntary celibates, and volcils is voluntary celibates. Anyway, there's this whole group of men who are obviously very alienated from society, and many of them do hold up a very toxic view of masculinity and say, okay, this is what we really are. And they're in the news because a couple of incels have actually committed mass murder. They've been so angry at women that they've gone into a place. One of them was a fitness gym, and shot 12 women. One of them was Elliot Rogers was the best known because he left behind a manifesto saying he was going to kill a bunch of people because this was his way of getting back at women for not having sex with him. And he was hailed on the manosphere and called Saint Elliot, And one person actually wrote, I support men actually killing women for women to realize that men are hurting and desperate because women are refusing to put out. That's how he put it. So this is a very hostile and very alienated group of men. And what I was happy though, Travis, as I found two examples of men who had been leaders on the manosphere and had become Christian.
Yeah, they renounced it. You mentioned that in the book. That was so encouraging. Sorry to interrupt you there. Exactly. I just was blown away by that. Go ahead and explain that for us.
Well, yeah, I agree. I'm glad you had that reaction because I did too. So one of them was known as one of the biggest sort of pickup artists. Oh, that's another group. PAU or pick up PUA.
Yeah.
Pick up artists. And he was one of the most reviled pickup artists, who would tell men, do this, do that if you want to, pick up women for sex. And then he had a background in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he reconverted back to Eastern Orthodoxy and, depublished all his books, which had been his source of income, and, announced on his webpage that he now was going to follow Jesus.
Yeah, he renounced it all. I repudiated it all. It was so encouraging to hear that, especially in the internet age today where things stay out there forever. And he says, no longer do I own any of this. I'm taking all this down. I was encouraged by that.
Yeah, and there was another one too. And in both cases, I put them in there because I wanted people to be encouraged that even the most alienated of men, can be reached with the gospel. Here were two cases of men who had both been leaders in this community and the manosphere, not just fringe people, not just hangers on, but actual leaders who had come to a conversion experience and had, like you said, repudiated all of their misogyny, all of their language about using women just for sex and women. Oh yeah, the guy who became Eastern Orthodox, he had a quote that I included where he said, "My first assumption on meeting a woman is dirty, worthless whore." I mean, that's my assumption of women. So he repudiated all that. And I just think it really shows the power of the gospel, and that we should never give up on anyone, no matter how extreme they seem.
Well, that was one of the parts that just really warmed my heart, to hear someone say, I had to go through this process of dehumanizing women in order to do to them these horrendous things, and then to see them saying, no, Christ has changed my life. He's come in. You see the power of what the gospel is and what it does in an individual's life, helping them even recovering this idea of what true masculinity is this idea of protection, of provision, of being there, being considerate as we've gone through that. When you were doing the research for this, what was the biggest surprise that you found?
Well, you mentioned something that I wanted to respond to.
Sure,
when
go
you
ahead.
said I was gonna spin off from when you said men. What did you say? Men are really called to be considerate and respectful and so on.
Loving.
And this might also be one of the most surprising things. So the first cross-cultural study of masculinity was done a few years ago, and by an anthropologist. And what he discovered was that no matter how different their views of masculinity were, all cultures share what he called the 3 Ps: the expectation that men will provide, protect, and procreate, build into the next generation. And he said it's universal, it's everywhere. Men are made in God's image. They do know what manhood is meant to be, that their unique strengths, biologically men are bigger, stronger, faster, and that their unique strengths are made not so that they can dominate others, but to provide, protect, and procreate. And I start the book, and that reminds me of another study that I started the book with. And as I mentioned, this was the most controversial book I've written. And when, I taught it in my class, and I had some reading groups to sort of rub off the rough edges. And when they would tell their friends about it, invariably, the first question would be, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? Is she some angry feminist bashing men, or is she some, reactionary? And then the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that I had to rewrite chapter 1 over and over to try to overcome that initial barrier. So many people just wanted to write it off immediately. And one of the things I found the most helpful was to cite another study. This was by a sociologist. He's fairly well known, so he speaks all around the world. And he's turned it into a study where he asked young men 2 questions, from Australia to Germany to Ecuador. He asked them 2 questions. And the first question is, what does it mean to be a good man? If you go to a funeral and they say he was a good man, what does that mean? And the men had no question, no problem answering that. They said, and I'll actually read it so you get their exact words: honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy, be a provider, a protector, be responsible, be generous. And the sociologists would ask them, where'd you get that? And they'd say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. In the air we breathe, that book that you just interviewed, the author. And in a Western culture, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would say, the sociologists would ask a follow-up question. And he would say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And invariably the young man would say, no, that's completely different. That's not the same thing at all. And they would say, and again, I'm reading this, it means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. So in other words, there are 2 competing scripts for masculinity. Not that every trait listed in the real man is bad, but if it's disconnected from a moral vision, then certainly things like, well, get rich, get laid. Those are the things we often identify as toxic. But it helped disarm people when I wrote my book, because then they didn't just say, whose side is she on? Like, you have to be all for men, be defensive on their behalf, or you have to be completely against them, talking about how toxic and harmful they are. No, you can say there are 2 scripts out there. Men are made in God's image, and they do know what the good man is. Universally, this guy's found it all around the world. but they also experience the cultural pressure to be the real man.
Mhm.
And the main debate or discussion today is not necessarily between men and women. It's within men's own head between these two competing scripts. And what that means is we don't just charge men with being toxic. Nobody responds well to
Right,
being called
right.
toxic. Nobody does. And so instead, it suggests a different strategy. The strategy is, how can we help affirm men in what they already know is the ideal of the good man?
Mhm.
Romans 2, we already know God's law is written in our hearts. So the strategy is, how can we affirm and support and encourage men to be the good man that they already know?
Mm. That's a very important point, I think, and you bring it out very, very well. You actually answered a lot of my questions even in there. As you were talking about, how do we bring this out? How do men do know this? They do know what this idea of a good man is. Even though in our culture today, there are so many households that don't have dads. And you allude to this where you talk about how one man in the pandemic started a YouTube channel and, Dad, how do I think that was it. Or how do I do this? And so they said within just a few months or days, there were millions of people, because so many people are growing up without fathers in the household. And I know, having been a pastor in the city of Chicago, working with teenagers, that I had one evening where I had about 20 young men on my back porch, and only 3 of them had dads in the household. And so it is a crisis. And this is across culture. This is not just one that's in one ethnic group or another. We had just a plethora of young men from all different ethnic backgrounds in an urban setting, and you just saw this across the board. I do love how you have alluded to the fact that this idea of masculinity does run across the board. It might look different in different cultures, but biblically, we see this masculinity is calling us to something deeper and something that is very countercultural to what we see right now. As you've delved into this subject, and I know the book hasn't been released as of this conversation yet, but there are some, I am sure, even within evangelical Christianity, are going to have a difficult time with this idea because of what we have seen alluded to. That's, you said this will be my most controversial, or it's already a controversial book. What have you heard from other people that they have deemed it to be controversial?
Well, let me start with the fatherless boys, because
Sure.
I think that the long-term solution to toxic behavior in men is better fathers. I cite one psychiatrist who says we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers, because fathers raising their sons is the most important long-term solution. And so we have to look at fatherhood. And everybody knows that fathers are mocked and ridiculed and made the butt of the joke in the media today. But
you
they know
even cite TV shows. You talk about Archie Bunker. You talk about how there was this trend where, and I can't remember that first television show that did it, but one television show made him to be a bumbling oaf. And from that moment on, every TV show had the dad as the bumbling oaf.
Yeah. Whether it's anime, animated cartoons and so on. I mean, Homer Simpson might be the one we know the best. But people know that, but they don't know why. And once again, it goes back to the Industrial Revolution, because for the first time, fathers were out of the home all day. And already in the 19th century, you see this in the literature where people began to express concern that fathers are no longer integrated into the family dynamics. They don't know what their kids are doing. They're not connected to their kids. They're not tuned into their kids' needs and feelings and emotions and experiences. And you begin to get some people saying, well, fathers is just irrelevant and fathers are incompetent as parents, because, if you're gone all week, of course, you don't know quite what to do with your kids. So already you get a lot of people starting to say, our kids are growing up without fathers, and this is not a good thing. And especially for boys, because boys were the ones, of course, who were working their fathers in the fields, or in the family industry. And all of a sudden, boys had a lot of free, unsupervised time. And the idea that boys will be boys, that boys are sort of naturally rambunctious and rowdy and rule-breaking, that's when that started. Nobody had that attitude toward boys before. That stereotype didn't exist. It came out of the 19th century when boys lost their fathers, and mothers tried to step into the gap. But of course, the boys could tell that the mother's life was different from their father's. And so when mothers tried to impose structure or moral principles, it seemed like they were asking boys to be girlish, be feminine. And so, of course, boys rejected that. The most prominent psychologists of the day said, never before in American history have boys been so wild and so half-orphaned because their fathers weren't there, and left up to female guidance in home and school and church. And so this is when the idea rose up that to be the real boy was to rebel against, those feminine structures that were being posed in home, church, and school, and to be sort of wild and rule breaking. And of course, when those boys grew up, they brought that with them. So it led into what you talked about earlier with novels portraying men as, the way to recover your true manhood is to get away, is to get away from civilization and to get away from the civilizing impact of women and family and so on. So the image of fatherhood that we have today is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution, when fathers were essentially taken out of the home. And so again, the solution is for men to find ways, even, you can't reverse the Industrial Revolution, but can we find ways to find some flexibility for fathers to be more involved with their kids? And I make the suggestion in the book that churches should make a higher priority of having a ministry to fatherless boys. I don't know that very many churches identify that as a specific ministry yet, but I think they need to, because the studies do show that father substitutes can have an incredible impact. Church youth leaders, coaches, teachers, and so on can have a real impact. And so I think we have to have a much more intentional approach to fatherless kids, but especially fatherless boys.
Well, I'm the representative of that. My father died when I was 4. So I grew up in a single parent household. My mother remarried later, but I looked for male examples any place I could find them. And being raised around women, I became more intuitive, but at the same time, I didn't have that, what at the time I felt more was that masculine trait. Like my friends were out hunting. I just didn't have interest in that. And my father could have been alive and I may not still have had that interest. I don't think he did. But I did look for that. And I saw that when I was in the inner city doing a lot of ministry, is how important those role models were. And I remember reading some research by Christian Smith, where he was looking at how so many young people, when they become believers in Christ, have they grown up in the church, but the parents lived out what they said. They suffered for their faith, but they also isolated a third thing. They said if there was an adult outside of the close family that reiterated what the parents were saying, they were more likely to stay within the church, which just shows that idea that you're talking about, these structures of family that help teach us and be together and not so be isolated on our screens and computers. I mean, it's the way we're at right now as a culture, but you're seeing a pushback as people are trying to figure out, and people are seeing that the world is catechizing us and we need to be able to fight back. And you give some real positive examples of men that I thought were doing that. As though this book is going to be out in the public square and people are going to respond, there are going to be, I would think, some are saying, well, what about femininity? What about that? Is there a toxic femininity that's out there? And how do we keep these two in tension? How do we highlight this masculinity? And yet, how do we also talk about where women and the contributions they've made, when traditionally, at least from a societal or secular perspective, women have been put down and their contributions have been minimized? How do we keep both of these in tension in a positive way that we can uphold both genders and what God has made them to be as both image bearers in serving Christ and extending his kingdom in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a book on men, so I deal briefly with women. I deal with women a little bit more in my earlier book, Total Truth. But of course, the Industrial Revolution, when it took men's work out of the home, it took women's work out of the home as well. Women used to be involved in a lot of household manufacture. They used to make canned foods and make their own clothes from scratch, and make buttons and make candles and make butter, whatever, make bread from scratch every day. Women had a real economic contribution to make. And even if they didn't have a lot of political rights, they had a strong sense of their economic indispensability, which really bolstered their self-esteem. They knew that they were indispensable to the household. When all of those things, from bread making to fabric making to butter churning, all was taken out of the home, for the first time, women had no economic contribution. Instead, they became economically dependent on the wages of their husbands. This was a huge loss in status. Most people don't think of it that way, but if you're not making a real contribution, already in the 19th century, you see newspaper writers starting to condemn women at home and say they're idle, they're lazy, they're useless, they're not contributing anything, they just take their husband's money and spend it. That language already was starting in the 19th century. And because women were not making an economic contribution, they also had less voice in the home. In other words, if they asked their husbands to contribute to the housework and the childbearing, well, that was her job, so that was nagging. So I think it's important to recognize that women also lost a lot in the Industrial Revolution. And we need to come back to the cultural mandate. Women are not just isolated to raising children and keeping the house clean, but women also were made to subdue the earth. Many women, I love raising children. I had a blast raising kids. I love it. But a lot of us do have talents and skills and interests and abilities that do go beyond what can be done in the modern household. And I think the answer for women is similar as to men, which is, can we bring some of that productive work back to the home? I do know a lot of women who do already. Almost every woman I know who's home raising kids is also doing some kind of income producing work. They're having some kind of a home-based business or telecommuting or whatever. Most couples can't really afford it anymore unless the woman is working part-time. So women are already doing this to a large extent, but I think we need to sort of rethink what that means. That women are called to subdue the earth just as much as men are, and that we should encourage that. Finding ways to do it without just turning your kids over to paid substitutes, though, is what I think what troubles a lot of people is, we have father absence, and that's been harmful. We don't want that followed by mother absence. Then who raises the kids? Why bother having them if you're not going to raise them? So I'm really big on raising young kids. I homeschooled my two sons, and because I loved it. I just loved being with them all the time. But I also, you can see behind me, I have my books. I was always working part-time while I raised my kids. So I was, editing books while sitting alongside the karate class, editing books while sitting beside the swimming lessons and so on. And people would come and say, what are you doing? I'm editing a book. And they weren't expecting that. But I did. I did a lot of work in my car office. I had one son who did a volunteer work at a nature center, and I sat outside in my car office doing my work. So women for a long time have been using this kind of flexibility to try to keep their intellect and their other interests going while raising their kids. And I think we should really work hard on making that as much as possible the ideal for both parents. Can we, in a sense, recreate some of the ethos of the colonial age, where the family, had so much more cohesion? The economic interdependence really reinforced their sense of emotional interdependence and made the family much stronger.
I would agree, and not just in the colonial period. I know you've rooted in American history, but we go back in the scriptures
Yes.
and just seeing how people worked alongside. I mean, I think of Ruth as she's out there gleaming, and we just need a better and more robust biblical understanding of how these two come together. And what does it mean to be engendered and embodied, especially in our culture today that seems to be pulling us in all manner of ways. We need to be able to embrace that the very basic parts of our humanity as engendered image bearers of God in the midst of our society, fulfilling the cultural mandate together. As we finish up here, and thank you for being so generous with your time, what do you hope that God does with this book?
Oh, well, as you know, I'm an apologist at heart. I'm a fighter. I want to defend the Christian worldview on all fronts. And so, I go into this with, how can we defend the Christian view of manhood? Basically, Christian view of manhood is under attack, vicious attack, and often from Christians too. You did mention Jesus and John Wayne. I was careful not to mention that in my book.
You did. I saw you mention the John Wayne. You didn't mention Jesus and John Wayne, but I saw there's other books that are out there.
No, I had Jesus. I do have Jesus and James Bond as a subtitle. But I didn't want to get involved in fights. But It is true that even Christian books are out there attacking Christian men. And so at heart, my goal is to defend the Christian understanding of men and women, and especially masculinity, since that's what's under attack. And, one thing we didn't touch on, it might be worth talking about a bit, is people do say, well, what do you think is the difference between men and women then? And so I had to put that in chapter 1 too. It's one of those questions you just have to cover at the beginning. And I just say, hey, let's start with biology. You can't really argue with biology because most of the controversial things are whether you talk about women's mental abilities and intelligence. Well, let's start with biology. Men are bigger, faster, stronger. They have more fast twitch muscles. That's a word I had to learn. It means you can react more quickly. They have 75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. And testosterone does make men more aggressive, more risk-taking. And these are good. These are created abilities that God made men to have, and therefore they are good. And we have to find ways to communicate, that we value, we support the way God made men. And the reason that people often resist wanting to acknowledge differences is because as soon as you acknowledge a difference, you kind of imply that someone else is less than. So it's very important that we don't imply that women are less than because they're not physically as strong. And we can talk about, sticking just to biology again, women's superpower is having kids. And we have to acknowledge that too is a strength, and that, taking care of a newborn takes an enormous amount of character. It means you have to be willing to be interrupted at any time during the day, and stop whatever you're doing, whether you want to or not. 3 a.m. for the feeding. You have to be, when a baby is in distress, you don't scold it, you don't reason with it. You alleviate its distress. You have to become incredibly sensitive to nonverbal cues because the baby can't talk yet. Right. And you have to become very sensitive to threats in the environment. This is why women need to become mama bears, because they have to, in a sense, identify with their child's vulnerability in order to be aware of threats in the environment. So these are all very positive character qualities. And I think we don't spend enough time saying what's good about the uniquely female qualities, because the masculine qualities have been held up as better. I mean, so much of the feminist movement is saying, oh, men do this, well, we can do it too, which is, often true. But it also tends to say that whatever men do is the standard. So I think it's important that we say, no, there are uniquely women's strengths, feminine strengths as well, and hold these up as character strengths. And men have more testosterone, women do have more estrogen, and estrogen is known as one of the bonding hormones. It makes them more relational, it makes them more connected. And so, this is what we bring,
Yeah.
what we bring to the table, and it should be valued as much as men's strengths are.
And I think that's something that we've really undervalued, as you've mentioned before. But I'm beginning to wonder, as I'm looking at the current cultural moment that we're in, as we're seeing, especially the war on women's sports go on, where you're hearing people and even athletes saying it's different. We are different. It is physically impossible that I can do some of these things, because our culture has believed this lie that you can, one is bad or one is good. It's not. They're just, I don't know why our culture in this moment can't see the beauty in the differences between men and women, and the strengths that men and women have. And I mean, even as you mentioned, women are aware of more fear. I think that was part of the book that you mentioned, where women are more online. I remember my wife saying, there's stuff that I think about that you don't think about. When I'm walking to my car at night, I am on. My head is on a swivel. I am ready to go. And you don't think about that. And I remember reading an article where one woman said, I've noticed that when men age, when they get to a certain age, then they become more aware of what women are dealing with, because they're less strong and protective, that they actually have to be aware of their surroundings. But do you see our society in this moment, as we're in this huge cultural chaos of confusion when it comes to gender and men and women and masculinity? Do you see even in the secular world, a shift where the pendulum goes the other way and people are responding and are going to hold on to traditional norms when it comes to gender and men and women? Do you think we're going to see that anytime soon?
Well, there's somewhat of that with the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, right? That he's affirming young men, the masculinity. And this one is not as well known yet, but on the female side, have you run into? There's some very liberal feminists who are now swinging with the pendulum and becoming more conservative. And the one I like the best is Louise Perry, who wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
Is she in Britain?
Yeah.
Yes, because I heard she started going to the same church where Tom Holland goes.
I hope they talk together.
Well, he actually talked to her about that, and she started going to church because Glenn Scribner was on the show, and he alluded to that fact in our conversation. He said she's a fascinating woman. She's not a Christian yet. He said, but she is moving in that direction because she sees how the sexual revolution is completely bunk. Completely bunk.
But how did she see it? Let me tell you this. So she was very leftist. She wrote for leftist publications. And then she started working at a rape shelter. And all of a sudden, she realized that all this feminist language of, we're just as good as men. We can do whatever men want. Whatever men do, we can do better. And then she looked at the sheer physical differences. In rape, what it means is the man is using his greater strength to overpower you. And if you don't acknowledge that men have greater strength, you won't put moral restraints on it. You must acknowledge the differences if you're going to hold men accountable, if you're going to make them responsible for what they do with that greater strength. I thought that was fascinating, that was the turning point for her. That she began to look at, okay, older rules about chivalry, hey, they actually made sense because you have to hold men in. And those older rules about being a gentleman, all of those sort of traditional rules make a whole lot more sense when you realize that the whole point of them was to put moral restraints on men's greater strength. I actually became more conservative in writing this book. I had little hanging on from my feminist background. This book, because nominal men have the highest rate of domestic violence in America, higher than secular men, I had to deal with that in the book. Otherwise it would look like I was just shoving it under the carpet. So I do have 2 chapters at the end on physical abuse in Christian homes. And I had the same response that Louise Perry did. I came to see that if we do not acknowledge men's greater strength, we will not, put the restraints on it that we need to. We have to acknowledge that men are stronger. We have to acknowledge the differences. You mentioned a moment ago the greater fear. That came from a psychological study, well, more than one, a couple of psychological studies that all found that women are more prone to fear. Well, of course they are. Even a secular person says this makes evolutionary sense. The evolutionist says this makes sense because women are smaller and weaker physically. They are more vulnerable to sexual assault. And when sexual assault happens, they have greater consequences, namely pregnancy. So of course it makes sense that women would, as secular people, they would say they are evolutionary programmed. It makes sense that women would have more fear, because one psychologist said this is actually the greatest psychological difference between men and women, that women are more prone to fear. And you can see it even in infants, even in newborns. They test newborns by with a sudden noise. How do they react to being startled by a sudden noise? Boys, all the way when they're infants, boys respond to a sudden noise by getting angry. How annoying. Who are you? I'm going to get back at you. Girls respond by getting afraid. I mean, you see this even in infants. So it's amazing that we need to acknowledge these differences if we're going to have healthy relationships between men and women.
Well, there's so much that we could talk about, Nancy. I know every time we get on a conversation, we can talk for hours about this, because even though you said something, I kept thinking of the study where you alluded to in that same part where if a man yelled in his home, the children would react even in a greater, more, fearful, because of the man's voice was bigger and boomer. I know in my house, when I get loud, my family notices this. I get loud when I can't find a parking space and I have to go to the bathroom. So my kids, it's become a running joke for them, but they get nervous because I get mad. I get mad really easy and my angry, and they're walking on eggshells. And even reading some of the instances of men getting angry in this book where they didn't even realize the power of their anger and just their mere presentation of their voice put fear in their family. And that caused me to want to pull back to be much more aware of things and how they go about. Now, I do want to finish on one little part here. As you mentioned, you alluded to abuse. We did an episode a while back with Michael Kruger on spiritual abuse within churches. And there's in no way should any Christian household have any type of abuse, emotional, spiritual, sexual, any which way. But you gave a kind of a word of caution, because some women have been abused and they've gone to their leaders and their leaders did not handle it well. They said it's either blamed them for soliciting that type of abuse and telling them to go back into those situations. I just want to make sure that everyone hears our conversation right now. And I want you to say this. Why did you include that part within this book, talking about abuse, especially within a Christian? And I'm going to put air quotes. Let's hope they're not Christian. Let's put them in the nominal category, best case scenario there. But
yeah, in terms of statistics, it is important to recognize that even church-going Christian men there is a percentage who are abusive. I think it was 2%. I'm going by memory. So it's a small number, but there are even men who attend church regularly, like my father. Like I started the book with my father, who was severely physically abusive, but man, he was adamant about being in church every Sunday. So there is a small percentage, even among church-going men. Most of them, however, are nominal. That's true. But I included that because up until very recently, this has been the main response of the part of the church has been, well, you need to love more. You need to forgive more. You need to make his favorite foods more. You need to have sex more. It's your job to fix your marriage. Even if the husband is actually being abusive, the church has largely held the woman responsible. When I was a young woman, a Christian woman told me, in marriage, you give 70% and your husband gives 30%. That's how it works. Well, that's how a lot of people see it. And I give plenty of examples to show, the bad responses that Christian women have gotten, and it's only recently, I'm glad I wrote the book when I did, because now very recently, you're starting to get people acknowledging that one adult cannot make another adult stop being abusive by just being kind and loving. because abusive people really do take forgiveness as permission to keep doing it. They take kindness as weakness. And if you just keep, forgiving, you're not holding him accountable, and he has no reason to change. So I included it because until very recently, this is the main response women have gotten from Christian leaders and Christian counselors. And so I canvassed the literature and found all the quotes I could from people saying, no, actually, the response to abuse is Matthew 18. Matthew 18 is the verse on how to hold people accountable. If somebody's sinning, you hold them accountable. That's your first step. And yes, you want to start with loving confrontation, but it is confrontation. You have to say, this is wrong. You have to be a sister of the Lord before you're a wife. We're both, a husband and wife are brother and sister in the Lord first. And husband and wife should be on top of that. It shouldn't contradict that. So I like I said, I was just very happy that the language is finally starting to change, and you're finally starting to see some Christian leaders saying we need to support women, and of course men too. But numerically speaking, statistically, it is mostly a male thing. Abuse in marriage is mostly male. And I quoted non-Christian and Christians on this. It's mostly a male thing, and so we can kind of say yes. The church, Stephen Tracy at Phoenix Seminary says the church needs to tell women it's okay to stand up to men who are disrespecting them, and it's the church's job to support the woman. He has a ministry called Mending the Soul, and he was one of my favorite sources. At any rate, yes, it's very, very recent. And if you talk to most women my age, they've lived for years with people telling them it's your fault. What did you do? What did you do? Yes, he shouldn't have hit you, but what did you do that made him hit you? We have lived with that for years. So just to let you know firsthand, we have lived with that for years, and it is so refreshing to see that the literature is starting to change and say, no, we have to hold men accountable. If there's actual sin in a marriage, you don't start by saving the marriage. You start by addressing the sin. That's your first goal.
These are so many of the subjects that we've touched on today. You've elaborated into the book. I do recommend the book to people, and I'm excited for it to see what God does with it. We often like to end our show with what we call the water bottle for the week. We are Apollos watered, after all. What is a water bottle that we can give to people to sip on as a result of our conversation today?
Can I say again that I'm an apologist, and my main goal is just to defend Christianity over against the accusations of the secular culture. This was the final trigger. I mean, I thought of writing the book, but the final trigger was the sociological data showing that Christian men are doing so well. And the churches don't preach this, Christians don't know this. And so let's really dig into that, and how can we affirm our Christian men, affirm them for what they're doing well, and encourage them and support them and help them just to do even better. I mean, you do better when you know that you're already doing well, right? Right. I mean, I play the violin. If somebody says, "Oh, that sounds horrible," I quit. If somebody says, but if somebody says, "Hey, that sounds kind of nice," then you keep trying, you keep working. So the best way to help Christian men is to affirm them for what they're already doing very well. So bring out those parts of this book. I mean, it's the chapters 2 and 3. So if you don't focus on anything else, focus on those 2 chapters, and maybe even look up some of my sources so that you can, bring in additional research. The main one is Brad Wilcox, because he's written a whole book. And it's kind of academic, come to think of it. So, but if you read those 2 chapters and say, okay, let's just start there, affirming, supporting, encouraging Christian men by saying they're already doing a good job, just do more of it.
I love how you mentioned in the book that on Mother's Day, women get the praise in church, but on Father's Day, dads get said to do better. And a church that I served at, the lead pastor of one of our campuses, his wife went to him and she goes, I'm so tired of you doing this. She said, what I want you to do is I want you to praise the men for being fathers. But she goes, if you're going to go after the men, you have to go after the wives too. We both need to do better in some respect. And so it was an equal thing. And he really appreciated that. And I know a lot of pastors are like, I'm not touching that, because they're fearful of it. They're going to get the response because they know how much women sacrifice. But I do think what you said is true. We do need to affirm what's there. Men have been so accused, in especially the last several years, and sometimes rightfully so, but you're helping us look at the pendulum and bring it back the other way to say, what does the scripture say? What does the data really show? Not just in anecdotes and what the secular media is telling us, but what do we see being worked out in people as we delve in deeper and not just accept the Christian whole label, but we separate it into those who really are trying to live it out, and we find something very different than what the secularized world is telling us. I want to thank you for writing the book. I do recommend it. Again, Baker Books. Where can we get that? You can get this at any bookstore, online, Amazon. Check it out. And one of your other books. I see them behind you because we've talked about Love Thy Body, Total Truth, Saving Leonardo. You've got a lot of books that are out there. But really, thank you.
Yes. So I have a website. I do have a website, nancypearcey.com. And so you can go there and have a chance to check out what else I've done. And yeah, right now, if you want to, you can pre-order the masculinity book, and the publisher is really pushing pre-orders this time because they finally figured out it helps the algorithms.
Yeah.
Amazon will give it greater publicity if you get a good spike from pre-orders. So just to say, if you're so inclined, go ahead and pre-order it.
Pre-order it, and you can pre-order it on. Do you do it on Baker, or can you get it on Amazon? Doesn't matter.
Well, it's Amazon is what determines everything now. So pre-order on Amazon. You can get it from the publisher as well, or christianbook.com, or wherever your favorite place is to order books.
Okay, make sure that we put that on the link, and we'll have that in the show notes available for people that they can purchase it when they have opportunity. But again, Nancy, thank you for coming on Apollos Water.
Great. Yeah, this was great. This was fun. A very in-depth conversation, so I've enjoyed it.
Love it.